Let me first of all say that I'm not a climate change skeptic, but I am a disappointed person as far as action on climate change is concerned. I think, in a sense, I'm not a scientist, the scientific evidence for climate change, rising overall temperature, or whatever it is, by 1 degree or whatever, is all there. That is not a problem. And when I first left India back in 1961, that tells you how long I've been in this problem. I got to New York, and at that time there was a big sensation. There was a book called Silent Spring. Now you may not have remembered this book called Silent Spring, but it was all about how using insecticides was destroying bird life. Because we were putting insecticides to kill insects, but the birds were eating those insects, and therefore, so we all ought to stop using insecticides. This was 1961, and everybody was suddenly well aware that our actions have consequences for nature that we live under. From there, I think things got worse year after year. And we got into this idea that somehow, and I think this was done when the spaceship went into orbit, somebody noticed the Earth as a single little thing ball out there. They said, wow, we are all one globe, we are one family, and therefore we all ought to think like a family. And climate change is our problem. So ideally, everybody thinks that climate change is a global problem, and therefore we all ought to do something about it. And there is no shortage of very enthusiastic people fighting for climate change. You know, we have something called Stop the Oil movement in UK. They're getting arrested all the time, and all sorts of other young people, sort of, you know, people are very idealistic about something to be done about climate change. And there is no shortage of solutions having been proposed for climate change. We have also had a lot of international meetings since before the Paris Agreement was signed, and since the Paris Agreement has been signed. We have all these COPs going on. Where 30,000 people suddenly lined up and you know, sort of talk about this. But there has been no solution. And one very interesting question is, then why is it that we have a problem? Everybody agrees that, okay, there are some people who are kind of skeptical about this problem, but I mean, they're basically oil producers. But you know, people are mostly agreed. And there are proposals, $350 billion ought to be transferred from the rich polluting countries to the poor unpolluting countries, and so on and so forth. Again and again, these numbers are bandied about, but nothing happens. And I have basically concluded, which is, and I hope I'm wrong, that there is a fundamental problem that we cannot actually agree on a joint welfare function of the whole world. It is not the case that the global welfare is involved, because to construct an idea of global welfare is actually, economists have argued long ago, impossible. And the economists, when they were having these arguments back in the late 40s, early 50s, they were having very technical argument. The technical argument went something like this, and you may or may not have done economics. I apologize, but it's an important point. Basically, economists think in terms of demand and supply and so on. And consumers, when they consume something, they get something called utility. The more you consume, I mean, every time you consume something, you get some more utility. Marginal utility is increased by each mouthful, so on. But the marginal utility decreases the more you have of anything. So it's a positive but decreasing marginal utility. And therefore, the richer you are, you get a lot of utility, but with every extra dollar that you spend, you get less utility than before. If you're poor, every dollar counts, and every little dollar gives you lots of utility to begin with. So somebody had an idea, a man called Pigou, Arthur Cecil Pigou, that in the world, if you want sort of rough equality, you ought to distribute income from the rich to the poor. Because the rich have this income for which they're not getting utility, but the poor will get more utility. So if you add up the utilities, it will be much bigger to have a redistributed income than if you have unequal income. Which made perfect scientific sense. And he was, at a very young age, he became a professor at Cambridge University and was very influential. That was a time when universal franchise had just come in the world. You know, for the first time, people were being considered to be equal to each other politically. And so there was an idea of equality. Then somebody from London School of Economics said, but you see, you were wrong, because you can't compare different people's utilities. People are different. I, as a rich man, may be listening to Beethoven's symphony, but for utility to me, of listening that much higher than somebody's bread and butter. How dare you compare my utility as a classical music appreciator to somebody else who is just a poor vagabond? So you can't actually add up utilities across a country people, therefore you can't have a social welfare function. So there's no argument for redistributing income. Now this particular, it is much more technical than what this was a very fundamental attack on the idea of equality. And all sorts of people tried to kind of find ways out. Can we find some kind of way out of this? And one way out was that it's also a bit technical. If all people have similar tastes and preferences in broad categories, in necessities, comforts and luxuries, just say all commodities are necessities, and if more or less people spend comparable amounts of their money on these three things, if they have similar tastes, not how much they consume, because that was an income, but proportionally. If something like that, if people are similar to each other, then you can have a welfare function. But if people are not similar to each other, well, the point of all this is saying that whenever the debate comes at one of these COPs, of transferring money from the rich to the poor, the rich countries say, but you know, not everybody in my country is rich. My poor people are going to object if I give my tax money away to somebody else who may use it or misuse it. So I have to look after my poor people, and I can't just kind of give up this just because you think I'm rich. I'm not really all that rich. I have got all sorts of problems. And similarly, for example, at the Glasgow COP about 3-4 years ago, India and China combined, and when India and China combined, it's a formidable coalition. And they basically frustrated the idea that coal should not be used anymore. You know, there was an idea that coal should not be used because coal was going to be very harmful. And India and China said, nothing bloody doing. We are poor countries. We require our coal deposits to be used for our people, and our job, and therefore you people may do whatever you want to do with your environment, but leave us alone. Now, see, that was a very strong argument in a sense by India and China, but it was actually not in favor of climate change. So people are saying, no, we don't owe you any debt whatsoever. Your problem is your problem. So in a sense, right now, we are caught in a situation where people may say that this is in the interest of all of us, but politically, actually, it is not easy to construct an agreement which is, as it was signed by all the parties concerned, and we have no global government, no overarching global government. The UN is not a good global arching government. We have no global arching government which will say, no, you will do X, because all of your future is dependent upon X, and therefore if you don't do X, people are going to suffer. That is our problem, therefore, is that while there is a lot of idealism, and we actually know the answer to problems, but somehow we lack the political will or political agreement to as it were, come to the solution which we ought to be able to. Now, I could say that it may just be that the world has lived through a very bad patch of economic stagnation. Since about 2008, the 1990s were very good for us. 1990s, we had global governance, Fukuyama had said history had come to an end, everybody was happy, we had growth and so on. 1991 to about 2008, we had fantastic growth. Since 2008, we haven't had GDP growth overall in the global economy. India and China have done very well comparatively, but by and large in the developed world, it's been real stagnation. So it could be, and I'm just looking for excuses to get out of the dilemma I'm in. It could be that if the economies of the developed countries improve, I mean, UK hasn't had any growth for 15 years now. If the economies of the developed countries improve, since they are the major polluters, they may become more friendly about agreeing to some kind of redistributive measure, and we may have some sort of equilibrium going on. Now, just to sort of conclude, for example, in UK we know that if we have solar panels, we'll be able to set sunshine as we have, which is not like India, we will need solar panels. But somebody says, but solar panels are made in China by slave labor of Uyghur Muslims, and therefore we can't have those solar panels. Now, when people may start doing things like that, it's very difficult to have an absolutely foolproof, 100% pure, ethical kind of decision which is agreed by all 100% of the people. So I think we have a decision-making problem, a problem of arriving at a joint idea of joint interest, which is so political. But I think it's going to be very difficult to arrive at that sort of joint. And this is the dilemma we are in. And all I can hope is that I'm wrong, and that there will be some leadership at some stage in some country. The only one more thing I want to say is that the most urgent need is not of people like us. The most urgent need is of people who live on islands in the South Pacific, and all islands are going to be submerged under a rising sea. And this is an absolutely serious problem. I mean, I can tell you in Goa, if you go to Goa, the beach is already being taken up by the sea. And people who build houses right on the seafront, not obeying the rules of finding that the gardens are being flooded by Palestine. So that is a serious problem of those people losing their islands. And nobody is doing anything about rehousing those people. That's a very urgent problem. And I don't know whether there is any movement in the climate change society to do something about that. But that is the most urgent problem. The fact that we will all be dead by 2,300, it doesn't really, not to 3,300 doesn't worry me. But I think it does worry me that there might be within the next 15, 20 years, no South Pacific island left where people can live.